Recently, I've been thinking about how much has changed since the 2024 election. I'll be honest, I didn't vote for Donald Trump this time around. I didn't expect much out of him. However, his Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, started auditing institutions, suddenly causing all these activist driven money laundering schemes that had quietly shaped our culture for years to be exposed to the public. Meanwhile, Trump showed in his recent confrontation with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky that he wouldn't play by the old rules of NATO and the so called rules based international order. A lot of people were caught off guard, including myself. But no one was more shaken than the radical left. For years, hardline leftists confidently pushed their vision of the world. Woke ideology was everywhere, pushed by universities, corporate HR departments, the media, and even the federal government. It wasn't just a set of fringe ideas, it became the backbone of American policy at home and abroad. Activism, too, was an extension of this dominance. The Black Lives Matter riots, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and other street level movements seemed untouchable. Back then, resisting these ideas came with real social and professional risks. But today, that momentum is gone. Leftists are panicked, and their influence is waning, and their arguments, if they have any, aren't cutting through. Worse yet, they aren't just powerless, they're lost, irrelevant, almost silent, except for the occasional Twitter meltdown about the rise of fascism. The distributist once said that you know when the left is hurt when they become very quiet. That made me curious. In the face of these losses, can leftists articulate what they stand for? What is their worldview, and how do they defend it when their dominance isn't a given? If leftism is a serious ideological tradition, then there should be serious arguments grounding it, and I wanted to find them. So join me today as I uncover 4 common arguments for leftism and why they don't stand up to even basic scrutiny. When I started looking for arguments justifying leftism, I thought of my immediate friend circle. Yes, I do have some leftist friends online. Having talked to them for a while about politics and philosophy, I noticed that they had embraced total value subjectivism. A lot of the leftists I know, smart, thoughtful people, don't tend to argue for leftism in a rigorous way. Instead, they operate according to a values-based approach. And I think this is the animating spirit behind most leftists. The idea is simple. Leftists care about certain concepts, things like equality, rights, and democracy. These aren't necessarily tied to some objective moral order. In fact, many leftists don't believe in objective morality at all. Their adherence to certain values is more like personal preference, a taste they have. They want leaders who respect these values, and they disdain those who don't. Policies like socialized medicine, support for Ukraine, or corporate diversity enforcement aren't just good policies to them. They're seen as necessary to uphold their values. And their opposition to the far right isn't necessarily about policy differences. It's about stopping people who they believe want to impose their values by force. Because even if these values aren't objective, they are theirs, and they must be defended, to the death if necessary. I wrote about this subjectivist ideology in my first Substack essay. Subjectivism is rooted in Enlightenment thought. Philosophers like David Hume argued that reason is the slave of the passions, that matters of fact and matters of value are entirely separate. From this perspective, morality isn't a set of universal truths, but rather an expression of personal preference. This view has been highly influential. Max Weber, for instance, argued that reason is silent on values. He described morality as a realm of competing factions. Questions of ends are questions of values, and on values, reason is silent. Values are created by human decisions, and each man's conscience is irrefutable. In this framework, the best we can hope for is to create neutral institutions that fulfill people's desires and maintain a stable peace. And this view isn't just limited to leftists. You find talk of values among anti-woke liberals who rally around freedom, and ethno-nationalists who champion tradition and the nation. Scratch the surface, and you'll find this same subjectivist worldview bubbling up. But here's the problem. If values are just personal preferences, and no guiding moral vision tells us what people ought to value, then society just becomes a battlefield of self-interested factions. It's a war of all against all, where peace is only maintained by whichever group has enough power to impose its will. Tolerance becomes impossible because someone must win. This is because the only alternative to rational discourse is violence, and, as Weber pointed out, reason is silent on questions of value. Logically, violence and deception become the sole means of resolving ideological conflicts. And beyond that, the Enlightenment idea that reason is powerless in moral debates is simply false. Leftist intellectuals have known this since the days of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Conservative thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre have also exposed the flaws in this view. Do their arguments really need to be reiterated? Perhaps one more time is necessary. According to the Frankfurt School, when we are mired in subjectivity, our reason becomes more and more a matter of self-preservation, both of ourselves and of the group that instantiates our values. This is because subjective reason is instrumental reason, thinking oriented to what is useful for oneself. Think about it. If I'm focused only on the means to achieve what I desire without considering whether I should desire this or that, then I will only be concerned with what is useful to fulfilling those desires. In the context of the war of all against all, inevitably caused by rampant subjectivism, what is useful is what helps one survive and gain power. Thus, the drive to self-preservation becomes all-consuming, since that is the only thing reason can focus on. Subjectivism thus falls into incoherence, because any real conception of the significance of what is being preserved is lost. The result is a nihilism that disintegrates the will to live in the first place. Life must have meaning, or else people will cease to live. This amnesia about the meaning of life, so common in the modern world, is remarked upon by MacIntyre's study of the history of ethics. It is little wonder, then, that both MacIntyre and the Frankfurt School point to the Enlightenment and its propagation of subjectivism as the primary culprit for this nihilistic tendency in our culture. The upshot is that this subjectivism is a dead end. Politically, it only leads to conflict and nihilism. Intellectually, it cannot justify itself on its own merits, let alone be used to justify leftism. It is an excuse, concocted by those who have forgotten what they are fighting for. When a leftist defends his leftism this way, what he's actually doing is begging for you to not examine his basic moral premises. Now, to be fair, this values-based approach, as common as it may be, is a pretty low-brow take on leftism. It's not really a serious intellectual justification for the ideology, but it's striking how many leftists seem unable to defend their worldview in any other way. And when they do try to make a more sophisticated case, the arguments don't get much better. The first non-subjectivist argument for leftism I found on Google was a Substack essay written by someone named Philosophy Bear. Now, this essay has a lot going for it. It's well-structured and coherent, and the author tries his best to make his utilitarian approach to leftism seem reasonable, even giving measured critiques to his own side. The essay begins with the author arguing that if you're a partisan, you should have a good explanation for why your side is always right, because it would be implausible for one political side to be consistently correct just by chance. He further states that political movements throughout history were attached to a concrete social group or a common philosophy, and it'd be strange if modern-day political movements like leftism lacked this. So far, so good. He then argues that most historically vindicated movements sided with the underdog. For example, during the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the peasants wanted things like the abolition of serfdom, wealth redistribution, better wages, and criminal justice reform. Today, most people would probably agree with them. To Philosophy Bear, this proves that siding with the underdog tends to be the morally correct stance. This seems at first like an appeal to democracy, as though the author is saying that a view is morally correct if the majority of people agree with it. However, the author points out that we have independent reasons to believe these movements also tend to make people happier. Resources, whether money, status, or security, are more valuable to those who have less of them. In his words, in general, your first dollar matters much more to you than your 100,000th. This is true all the more so of specific purchasable goods. I suspect it's also probably true of more abstract goods that cannot be purchased or are difficult to purchase, like status, procedural fairness, free time, security from violence, and so on. Therefore, ideologies prioritizing shifting power and resources from those who have more to those who have less will increase overall happiness. Leftism is just the ideology that sides with the weak against the strong, so, in the author's view, it is preferred from a utilitarian perspective. Furthermore, since history shows that these shifts tend to be vindicated, we should assume leftism is, in the long run, correct. However, after I read the article, I remember feeling a bit left down because its flaws were very apparent. First, the argument proves too much. By the author's standard, siding with underdogs would always be the morally correct position to take. But even leftists admit that some groups don't deserve this sympathy. They know that a leftist society must exclude ideological dissidents, the so-called intolerant, even if that makes them the new underdogs. This isn't hypocrisy, it's just the reality that you can't side with every underdog group. Now, I suspect that the author would moderate his position if I made this objection. Perhaps siding with the underdog isn't always correct, but maybe it has good outcomes more often than not. But in that case, how do we know which underdogs are worth defending? Were the aristocrats and clergy executed during the French Revolution underdogs? How about the Russian and Chinese peasants who starved under communism? Or what about today? What about the people who have been robbed or killed by illegal immigrants or non-white criminals, aided and abetted by left-wing policies? The unborn children killed by abortion? The working class people punished for hate speech? If the right had created these victims, leftists like this author would call them underdogs. But since leftist policies created them, they're ignored or even mocked.
Anyone remember this?
In America, there's a thing about both white vigilantism and white tears, particularly male white tears. Really white tears in general, because that's what Karens are, right? They Karen out, and then as soon as they get caught, it's like, Green Waterworks.
Many months later.
And that, I'm sorry, that what I was doing had value. No.
Thank you, Aristocratic Utensil, for that example. It's apparent from the behavior of Joy Reid and other leftists that they have some method of deciding which underdogs are worthy of their moral consideration, and it's predictable even to non-leftists. However, Philosophy Bear never elucidates why. To be honest, I don't think he can. It would require going into the structural purpose of the left and its role as institutional entropy rotting the foundations of civilization, but that's a whole separate video. Another problem is that this utilitarian approach doesn't consider what happens when you prioritize underdogs over the stability of society. After all is said and done, it's better to be a part of a stable society than not. Even if you aren't living at large, even if life is difficult, if you have some measure of security, access to resources, and purpose to strive for, all of which are blessings of civilized life, then that's more important than abstract concepts like equality. But if all that matters is shifting resources from the strong to the weak to make the amount of happiness on this nifty little graph go up, then maintaining civilization becomes secondary. The result? Crime rises, social trust collapses, and the people left behind have to fend for themselves. I suspect that this kind of utilitarian thinking is exactly why so many bureaucrats push for lax policing, mass migration, and policies that weaken national cohesion. If you view the entire world as a game of who has more and who has less, then everything just becomes a giant math problem. This appeals to the psychology of those addicted to seeing numbers on a line increase. What gets lost in their calculations is that a society must first exist before it can support the less fortunate. So while philosophy bears argument is more thought out than the values-based approach in that it is at least superficially plausible, it still has gaping holes. Taken at face value, it supposes that siding with underdogs is always the right move, which is an obvious falsehood. Scratch the surface, and you find that there is an unstated principle demarcating which underdogs deserve support, something no graph can elucidate. But if the utilitarian argument was flawed, the next one I found was even worse. Say what you will about the utilitarian argument, it at least tried to be logically consistent. The third leftist argument I found was more of a rhetorical weapon. It's the idea that Christianity itself supports leftism. You've probably seen the memes. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus helped the poor. Jesus flipped tables in the temple. And recently, in response to Doge's foreign aid cuts, the Southern Poverty Law Center posted a blasphemous image of our Lord with a hammer and sickle, alongside Acts 2:44 through 45. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any had need. Now, Christians immediately pushed back, accusing the SPLC of bad faith concern trolling. You know the kind. Acting like they care about Christianity just to attack conservatives. The SPLC responded by doubling down. You don't need to be a Christian to point out hypocrisy. Here, they act as if the Bible were just a political manual for modern American policy. This isn't a new tactic. Leftists have been trying to twist Christianity into supporting their ideology for centuries. You find 19th century popes warning their flocks against it, calling it a distortion of the Gospels. And we know it's a distortion because applied Christianity looks nothing like the leftist version. If leftists were suddenly transported back in time to the height of medieval Christendom, they would be horrified. Traditional Christian societies were, by modern leftist standards, theocratic, hierarchical, and deeply conservative. Homosexuality was banned. Class structures were enforced. The death penalty was used regularly. While capitalism as we know it didn't exist, private property absolutely did, and no one, aside from a few radical fringe sects, was advocating for anything remotely resembling communism, let alone social democracy. Let's be real. If leftists today had to live in a Christian society, they wouldn't be praising it. They would be calling it fascist. Now, maybe a kind of leftist Christianity was plausible in previous generations, back when everyone was vaguely Christian, but that isn't the case anymore. The people who claim that Jesus was a socialist are the same people who mock Christians constantly. They don't believe in the authority of the church. They don't believe in Christian teachings on sex, family, or the nature of sin. They reject Christianity as a legitimate moral system, only invoking it when it's politically useful. That's not an argument, that's manipulation. If leftists truly believed Christianity was authoritative, they would submit to all of its teachings. But they don't. They only cherry-pick verses to suit their political goals, while ignoring the vast majority of Christian doctrine and practice that contradicts their ideology. This applies to leftist Christians as well. If you consider yourself a Christian and a leftist, you need to contend with the fact that, for most of history, Christians would have rejected your theology. The progressive Christian movements that do exist are heresies that rise and fall with political trends. And if history is any guide, the heresy you believe in will fade in time too, just like all the others before it. But there's an even deeper reason why leftism and Christianity don't mesh. Leftism is, at its core, a politics of resentment. It's driven by a desire to tear down those who have more, whether that's power, wealth, or influence. But Christianity condemns resentment as envy, one of the 7 deadly sins. Ideally, a Christian society wouldn't be obsessed with revenge against the privileged or increasing one's status. It would emphasize charity, humility, and personal moral responsibility, virtues anathema to leftism. So no, Christianity doesn't justify leftism, and the fact that leftists feel the need to co-opt it just shows how weak their own ideological foundations are. The final leftist argument I want to address in this video isn't one I hear much of anymore, but it's worth refuting for its historical significance. It's John Rawls's veil of ignorance, an argument that was once considered the gold standard for justifying liberalism. Rawls argued that a society is only just if it would be judged as fair from behind a veil of ignorance, a hypothetical scenario where individuals in a state of nature don't know their race, sex, religion, or personal beliefs. In this original position, Rawls claimed that rational people would choose a society with maximal individual freedom and a kind of liberal socialism, one where inequality is only allowed if it benefits the least well-off. In other words, if you strip people of their identities and make them choose a social order from a position of neutrality, they'll inevitably pick something resembling a modern left liberal democracy. It sounds nice in theory, but there are glaring problems with this argument. The biggest issue is that this entire thought experiment is detached from reality. Human beings have never existed in a state of nature where they could rationally design a society from scratch. We don't enter the world as blank slates either. We are born into families, traditions, and cultures that shape who we are. Rawls treats these things as unimportant to the pursuit of justice, but if you remove a person's race, sex, and religion from them, you're not left with a real human being. You're left with a disembodied, deracinated abstraction. And if someone had actually been raised in total isolation from identity, culture, or community, they'd be the last person capable of judging what makes a society just. Justice isn't about what someone might prefer in a hypothetical vacuum. It's about giving people what they actually deserve within the concrete reality of human society. But Rawls's thought experiment ignores the very factors that determine what people deserve in the first place. Rawls presents his conclusions as if they're objective and universal, what any rational person would choose. But they're not. They are simply the moral intuitions of a mid-20th century liberal New England professor. In many ways, the veil of ignorance argument is just the subjectivist argument for leftism we discussed earlier, repackaged with sophisticated language to make it sound more reasonable. There is nothing universal about Rawls's preference for sexual libertinism and egalitarianism. These are not timeless principles. They are the product of a very specific historical and cultural context. And the fact that the left has largely abandoned Rawls shows how flimsy his framework really was. Rawlsian liberalism used to be the intellectual backbone of the left, but now it's mostly been discarded, replaced with something even more incoherent. If Rawls's framework is outdated, what has the left actually replaced it with? Nothing better. The left doesn't rely on reasoned defenses of its ideology. Instead, it falls back on a handful of rhetorical tactics. The most common is moral blackmail. If you care about the poor, about minorities, about democracy, you need to do what we say. No real argument, just an emotional appeal with an implied threat. Then there's shaming. You're a racist, you're a fascist, you're a terrible person. This isn't meant to convince, it's meant to shut people up and enforce social pressure. And when those don't work, they appeal to science, or at least the science. The same science that justified destructive COVID lockdowns and then got discarded the moment it contradicted their ideology. If science backs their position, it's gospel. If it doesn't, it's bigotry. What all of this suggests is that leftism is floundering. It's not that it lacks power. It still controls institutions, media, and the broader culture. But what it doesn't have is an intellectual raison d'etre. It has no real justification for itself, no compelling story of why it's right and its opponents are wrong. What remains is inertia. If leftist institutions lost their funding, their influence would collapse within a generation. That said, I believe that something like the left will continue to exist in the future. What that looks like, I have no idea. But one thing is clear: if leftists want to remain relevant in the long run, they need to do better than this. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, and have a nice day.